Seattle, 1974. A young woman walks to her car in a parking lot. A man approaches. His arm is in a cast. He's struggling to carry a stack of law books. He's polite, almost shy. He asks if she'd mind helping him carry them to his car, just a few steps away. She says yes. It's the last decision she will ever make. Over the next 4 years, at least 30 women across 5 states would vanish the exact same way. Not dragged into an alley, not attacked by a stranger lurking in the dark, but lured, calmly and willingly, by a man who looked like the safest person in the room. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was standing in plain sight, smiling, well-dressed, impossible to suspect. Police would later say he was so ordinary looking, so charming, that women who escaped him alive sometimes still felt guilty for being suspicious of him at all. His name was Ted Bundy. And for nearly 2 decades, his case would force an entire country to ask an uncomfortable question. What if evil doesn't look like a monster at all? Theodore Robert Bundy was born in November 1946 in Burlington, Vermont. His origins were quietly complicated. His mother was unmarried and had traveled from Philadelphia to a home for unwed mothers to have him. For years, young Ted was raised to believe his grandparents were his parents, and that the woman who was actually his mother was simply his older sister. He wouldn't learn the truth until he was a teenager. Some who later studied his case believe that discovery, the sense of having been quietly lied to by the people closest to him, planted something that never fully left him. He grew up in Tacoma, Washington, and on the surface, everything about his childhood looked unremarkable. Neighbors remembered a polite boy. Teachers remembered good grades. He later attended the University of Washington, studying political science, and by every outward measure, he was thriving. He volunteered at a crisis hotline, spending nights on the phone talking suicidal strangers back from the edge. He worked for a Washington state governor's re-election campaign. He dated a steady girlfriend for years, a woman named Elizabeth Kendall, who by all accounts loved him and had no idea what lived beneath the surface. Everyone who knew him used the same words: intelligent, charming, going places. But Bundy would later describe something else entirely. A second self he called an entity. Something he said had been growing inside him since he was young. Something he spent years trying to control through sheer willpower and denial. Investigators would later suspect his very first act of violence may have happened as early as 1961. When an 8-year-old girl named Anne Marie Burr disappeared from a home just blocks from where 14-year-old Bundy lived. He denied it for the rest of his life. But by the early 1970s, whatever he had been suppressing was no longer something willpower could hold back. It started with an assault that almost went unnoticed. In January 1974, an 18-year-old student named Karen Sparks was attacked in her Seattle apartment while she slept. Beaten so severely she suffered permanent brain damage. She survived. At the time, no one connected it to anything larger. Weeks later, 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy vanished from her off-campus bedroom in the middle of the night. Her bed was found carefully made, with blood on the pillow. Then it kept happening. Donna Gail Manson, a student at Evergreen State College, vanished walking to a jazz concert on campus. Susan Rancourt disappeared walking back from an evening meeting at Central Washington State. Roberta Parks vanished from Oregon State. Each case looked isolated. Different towns, different campuses, no connection anyone could immediately see. The only thread, when investigators finally started comparing notes, was a description that kept surfacing from witnesses. A young man, attractive, well-dressed, sometimes wearing a cast or a sling on his arm, always polite, always asking for help. Then, on a single summer afternoon in July 1974, at Lake Sammamish State Park, that pattern became impossible to ignore. In broad daylight, in front of a park full of witnesses, a man introducing himself as Ted approached multiple women, arms supposedly injured, asking for help loading a sailboat onto his car. Several turned him down. 2. Didn't Janice Ott and Denise Naslin vanished within hours of each other from the same crowded park? For the first time, police had something solid. Dozens of witnesses, all describing the same man, the same voice, even the same beat-up tan Volkswagen Beetle. Composite sketches went out across the state. Tip lines lit up with thousands of calls. One name came up among them, a law student named Ted Bundy, but it was buried in a mountain of other leads. Nobody yet had a reason to believe the well-spoken young man with the political science degree was the one they were looking for. By the time investigators started connecting the disappearances into a single case, Bundy had already left Washington behind. For Utah, then Colorado, then Idaho. Each new state, the pattern repeated, and each time the killings grew bolder. In August 1975, it wasn't a detective's brilliant deduction that finally caught up with him. It was a stop sign. A Utah patrol officer noticed a Volkswagen roll through an intersection late at night and pulled it over. Inside the car, he found a ski mask, a crowbar, rope, and a pair of handcuffs. It looked less like an innocent traffic stop and more like the discovery of a toolkit, one built for something no one had a name for yet. Bundy was arrested. Investigators soon connected him to the attempted abduction of a young woman named Carol D'Orange, who had managed to escape from his car alive, one of the few people who ever would. Her testimony helped convict him of kidnapping. He was sentenced to prison in Utah. It should have ended there. It didn't. Colorado authorities, working a separate murder case, charged Bundy and extradited him to Aspen to stand trial, acting as his own legal counsel, a decision that stunned the courtroom. Bundy was given access to the courthouse law library to prepare his defense. During a recess in June 1977, guards briefly lost sight of him. He jumped from a second-story window. He spent 6 days on the run through the Colorado mountains before exhaustion and hunger forced him back toward civilization, where he was recaptured driving an erratic vehicle outside of town. For a moment, it looked like the story was over. It wasn't even close. On New Year's Eve, 1977, inside the Garfield County Jail, Bundy spent weeks quietly losing weight, enough to slip through a gap in the ceiling of his own cell. He crawled through the crawl space above the jail, dropped down into the apartment of the jail's own administrator, and simply walked out the front door into the winter night. Guards didn't discover he was missing until the following morning. This time, he didn't stay in Colorado. He kept driving through Chicago, through the South, all the way to Tallahassee, Florida. In Florida, Bundy briefly tried to build something like an ordinary life, renting a room under a false name, picking up odd jobs, blending in. It didn't last. In the early hours of January 15, 1978, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house near Florida State University's campus. What happened over the next 15 minutes would become one of the most violent single episodes in the history of American serial crime. He moved from room to room. Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy were killed. 2 more residents, Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler, were brutally attacked but survived, left with lasting injuries. He then crossed the street to another apartment and attacked a 5th student, Cheryl Thomas, who also survived, though the assault left her permanently deaf in one ear. It happened inside a house full of sleeping students. Almost none of them heard anything until it was already over. Barely a month later, Bundy abducted his youngest known victim, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, from outside her middle school in Lake City, Florida, in the middle of a school day. Her remains were found weeks later near an abandoned shed. The manhunt that followed moved fast. On February 15, 1978, a Pensacola police officer noticed a stolen Volkswagen driving late at night with its headlights off. When he pulled it over, the driver fought back hard, trying to escape on foot. The officer subdued him and asked for identification. The man refused to give his name easily. It was Bundy. This time, there would be no third escape. Bundy's trial for the Chi Omega murders became the first criminal trial in American history to be broadcast live, coast to coast, on national television. And Bundy, ever aware of an audience, seemed to relish every second of it. He fired his attorneys and chose to represent himself, cross-examining witnesses and arguing legal motions directly with the judge. Reporters packed the courtroom daily. Outside, a strange kind of celebrity had formed around him. Women mailed him love letters in prison. Some even attended the trial hoping to catch his eye from the gallery. It was a phenomenon psychologists would later give a name: hybristophilia, an attraction some people develop toward those who commit violent crimes. Then, In the middle of his own sentencing hearing, Bundy did something that stunned even the reporters who thought they'd seen everything. He called a woman named Carol Ann Boone, a friend from years earlier in Washington who had stayed devoted to him through the trial, to the witness stand and proposed marriage to her, right there in open court. Because a Florida notary happened to be present in the room, the proposal and her acceptance were enough to make the marriage instantly, legally binding. None of it swayed the jury. He was convicted of the Chi Omega murders and, months later, of Kimberly Leach's murder as well. He was sentenced to death, twice over. For nearly a decade after, Bundy sat on death row in Florida State Prison, filing appeal after appeal, always maintaining his innocence to the cameras and to the journalists, including Ann Rule, a true crime writer who had once worked beside him, unknowingly, on that Seattle crisis hotline years before his crimes began. By January 1989, every appeal had run out, and with nothing left to bargain for, Bundy did something he had refused to do for 15 years. He started telling the truth. Over his final days, he confessed to investigators from multiple states, describing murders that had haunted cold case files for over a decade. He walked them through locations, methods, timelines, admitting for the first time to killings police had long suspected but could never prove. He gave a final interview to psychologist Dr. James Dobson, in which he described a growing addiction to violent pornography as something that had fueled his crimes, without ever fully owning what he had done to another human being. He confessed in total to around 30 murders. Investigators who studied his case for years afterward believe the real number may be far higher, as many as 50 or even 100 spread across states and years. Some victims never identified, some bodies never found. On the morning of January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was led into the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. Outside the prison gates, a crowd of several hundred people had gathered overnight, some holding signs, some singing, some setting off fireworks. When word came that the execution was complete, the crowd cheered. Inside, in his final moments, Bundy asked that his love be passed on to his family and friends. Then at 7:16 in the morning, he was pronounced dead. In accordance with his wishes, his body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered across Washington's Cascade Mountain Range, the same wilderness where, decades earlier, hikers had discovered the remains of some of his very first victims. Ted Bundy didn't look like a monster. That was never an accident. It was the entire mechanism his crimes depended on. For years, that ordinary, likable face let him walk directly past a country's suspicion, again and again, until it was already far too late for the people who trusted him. Decades later, his case is still taught in criminology courses, still studied by profilers, still referenced anytime someone insists that a killer seemed so normal. Because Bundy's real legacy isn't the number of his victims, a number we may never fully know. It's the uncomfortable lesson his case forced an entire generation to learn, that evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it looks exactly like everyone else in the room. If you want more dark, true stories from America's past, subscribe to the 1980 American Story, and I'll see you in the next one.